Hi YouTube, welcome back to another episode of The Safety Specialist where I am the safety specialist. So today's episode I thought we would talk about lockout tagout. There are 6 steps to lockout tagout. The first one is preparation, second shutdown, third isolation, 4 the actual lockout tagout, 5 stored energy check, and 6 isolation verification. Now before I go any further, do you know what the purpose of lockout tagout is to keep you safe. So let's say that you wanted to change an outlet in your own home. Lockout tagout would still be applicable to you. The first thing you would do is the preparation. So you make sure that you investigate and have a complete understanding of all types of hazardous energy that might be controlled. Like I said, you want to change an outlet in your home. The first step is to prepare. Well, where's the outlet getting the energy from? The electricity. That's the kind of energy that you want to prevent from transferring and potentially harming you while you're changing the outlet. So where would you go? You would go to your electrical panel. And hopefully your electrical panel is labeled. If it's not labeled, you may want to hire an electrician to help you with that, because it's very important to know where your energy is going from each circuit breaker. So if you're working on an outlet, let's say in a bedroom, you'd want to make sure that the circuit that you're shutting off is actually going to be the one that's giving power to that room. You don't want to shut off a breaker and then it turns out it was mislabeled and you shut power down to the wrong room, and if you don't check you could get hurt. So it's very important that you investigate first. You make sure that your electrical panel is actually labeled correctly, and then you can move on to step 2, the actual shutdown. So when it's time to shut down, you make sure that you tell anyone else in the area what you're doing before you do it, because you don't want someone to, while you step away, maybe your phone rang, maybe you had to go to the bathroom, your doorbell rang, and there's someone else in the house. Then they go into the room, they try to plug something in, they say, hey, what's going on here? Why is there no power to this outlet? Then they go to the electrical panel, they don't tell you, they turn that breaker back on. Then by the time you get to that room, they're gone. You may not have known that they turned on the breaker. So that's part of lockout tagout, is you're going to be notifying. Let people know that you're going to be shutting that down, and for approximately how long. So the next is the isolation. It's to isolate, like I said, the piece of equipment that you're working on. So if it's the outlet, you're isolating your work to that outlet. If you're working on, let's say, like plumbing, if let's say you need to turn off the water, you could turn off a valve, you know where the valve is located. So for electrical, you shut off the breaker. For something like plumbing and water, you turn off the valves. Now it's time for the actual lockout tagout. So now that you've isolated the piece of equipment that you want to work on, the next step is you shut it down and then you put a tag on it. They sell a variety of tags for lockout tagout at a variety of stores online. You just have to Google lockout tagout equipment and you'll be able to find it. So what it is it's a visual. You put it on the breaker, you put it on the valve with your initials, and this way, if let's say when you started working on the equipment, maybe there was nobody home, if you're in an office, there was nobody else in the office. But now as you're working, now someone comes in, and maybe the breaker you turned off also feeds electricity to another room, or the water you shut off feeds water to another area, and they're trying to figure out why they can't use the electricity or they can't use the water. So they're going to go, and where are they going? They're going to the breaker or to the water valves to turn it back on. Well, if your tag is on it and it's physically locked, meaning they can't remove it, and they can't turn on the breaker because they don't have the key to remove your lock, you're safe now. And they visually see, oh, okay, the safety specialist is working on this circuit breaker. I can't turn it back on. They are the ones with the key, so only they could turn it back on. Now, let's say we're working on a bigger scale environment. We're working for, a business, operation, and there's 3 of us working on the same piece of equipment. All 3 of us are going to lock the equipment out. We're going to lock the breaker or the valve. We're going to have our personal locks on it with each individual key. Well, why is the purpose for that? If the 3 of us are working on it, why do we need 3 locks? Well, let's say, we all decide to go out to lunch. Great. Now we come back and we're working on it again. And you know what? I think I finished my part. So I'm going to take off my lock and I'm going to go. And then, a couple of hours go by, and then the next person, they finish their part, and they're like, okay, I'm done. I take off my lock, and, they're also going to leave. The third person is still working. Now, let's say, the 3 of us planned that, this project was going to be finished at 2 p.m. Well, now it's like 2:30, and people are saying, hey, what's going on? I'm still not getting power. They call me, hey, safety specialist, I thought you said you were going to be done by 2. What's going on? So I go over there and I go to the breaker and I see that there's still 1 more lock on it. Now I contact my coworker, hey, what's going on? Why is it still shut down? Well, it turns out maybe, something happened and it took longer than it was supposed to. That's why there's 3 locks. This way, the first person or the first 2 people, if there's 3 people working on it, that they don't assume that the project's finished on time and they're just going to turn the circuit breaker back on. It lets us know that something's still going on and we need to check in with, the other coworker. So that's why there's multiple locks. Each person working on a piece of equipment should have their own lock. So, step 5 is the stored energy check. Just because you turned off the power doesn't mean that, maybe there's still some residual electricity, in the outlet or, a piece of machinery. Did you ever notice that, after you unplug a radio, sometimes you could still hear the music, but it's not plugged? It takes a few seconds sometimes for the radio to actually turn off after you unplug it. That's because it still has stored energy. So if I'm working on a piece of equipment, like, I'll use the radio as an example. If I just unplug it and I tried to get to work right away, I might get shocked because it still has residual energy in it. The same thing with water. Just because I turned off the valve doesn't mean that there's still maybe residual water in it. Well, what's the hazard with residual water? Well, if it's a steam valve, there's still potentially hot steam in those pipes. That means you could still get very badly burnt. So the residual power, the residual energy in a steam pipe, it may take a few minutes, an hour, maybe longer, depending on how hot, the steam was, how big the pipe was. From the time you officially locked it out till the time it's safe to start working on is 2 separate things. You have to make sure that just because you locked out the equipment, it doesn't mean that the hazard has completely exited. So then step 6 is the isolation verification. So now that you've gone through all those steps, you still need to make sure that what you're working on is correctly isolated. Remember how I said make sure your electrical panel is properly labeled. Well, how do I check, that there's no more power? You could plug in a electrical meter tester. You could plug in a radio. If it still has power going to it, you'll know. The radio will turn on. Your tester will indicate that there is power going to that outlet. How do you know with the water? Well, you turn the power on at the water on at the source. Let's say I'm working on my sink and I turned off, what I thought was the water valve that feeds the sink. Well, before I start taking the plumbing apart under the sink, let me just do a quick test, turn on, the faucet, maybe the cold water, and if water comes out, it means obviously I have not shut off the correct water source. So it's very important that you verify before you start working. So those are the 6 steps to lockout tagout. Well, why is lockout tagout so important? Well, let me tell you, this actually happened. This is, true story, not made up. Back in October of 2012, some of my former coworkers, they may remember me telling them this, is Bumble Bee Tuna faced felony charges in horrific death due to lockout tagout failure. So what had happened was a 62-year-old employee, his name was Jose Molina, he was essentially cooked to death while working at the Bumble Bee Tuna foods plant. And his death, the people who were involved in it were brought up on felony charges. So this gives you, other than the fact that, this poor man died because of someone else's mistakes, it shows you the importance of, following these OSHA policies and protocols and how you can actually be brought up on prosecution charges if you don't actually follow these procedures. So Bumble Bee Foods and 2 of its employees had been charged with willfully violating safety rules. So it wasn't just a corporation. It was 2 individual employees also that were brought up on these charges. So I'm going to link the article that I'm discussing. It's from Martin Technical. I'm going to put the link in the comments below. So basically, prosecutors said that workers were unaware that Molina was making repairs inside the pressurized steam cooker, and they loaded 12,000 pounds of tuna into it and turned it on. So he was the maintenance guy doing maintenance work on this piece of equipment, and nobody knew he was in it. And they dumped 12,000 pounds of tuna right on top of him. And then they turned on the machine. So this failure in employee safety training and lockout tagout procedures resulted on him being tragically and avoidably cooked to death. During the 2-hour heat sterilization process, the oven's internal temperature rose to about 270 degrees. Molina's severely burned remains were discovered by a coworker. Bumble Bee Foods could be fined up to $1.5 million, and the plant's director of operations and former safety manager could get 3 years in prison each. The 2 Bumble Bee employees involved face a maximum sentence of 3 years in state prison and or $250,000 fine if convicted. So I want you to take a second, let that settle in. The plant director of operations and the former safety manager. Why were they brought up on prosecution charges? It's because lockout tagout was not being enforced. It was not being trained properly. There were no records, that this piece of equipment was actually properly locked out, tagged out. There was no records that, Molina had the training to lock out the equipment that he was actually working on. This whole situation could have been avoided if they had followed the OSHA guidelines for the lockout tagout. So, I mean, like I said, like that's just, tragic, what had happened. But what can you do? Well, OSHA requirements are really for annual training. So if this Bumble Bee Tuna plant had given annual trainings to their staff, they would have had records of all staff members who were trained in lockout tagout procedures. They would have had documentation showing the kind of training that they had received, and that the staff had signed off stating that they understand the training that they received. And this would be an ongoing procedure. So every year the staff will receive this training. Anytime someone new is brought in, right off the bat they receive this training, and then they continue to receive it annually, so that something like this could be avoided. And so since, there was no documentation like this, there was no proof that, this training had taken place, that's why they were brought up on these charges. And like I was saying, that was totally unavoidable. It didn't need to happen. And it's something that, we might not think about, but while we're working in our homes, a lot of accidents are completely avoidable. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about lockout tagout. Because again, people are doing a lot of home renovations, and you want to make sure that if you're doing anything electrical or if you're working on plumbing, that you're taking these safety precautions, because it could help prevent, an injury or worse, death. So, on a lighter note, I'm working on getting some guest speakers, and one of the topics that I will be doing in a future episode will be pet safety. And my cat decided to stop by. So we're going to be talking about pet safety in future episodes, and how to avoid heat stress, and how to make sure that the home environment, or if you're going traveling, things of that nature, that you yourself and your pets are safe. And like I always say, your safety matters. And if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, please subscribe, please comment on whether you have any suggestions, or if you would like more information. And I hope you enjoyed this video. So thanks again for watching another episode of The Safety Specialist. I appreciate you, and stay safe out there, because your safety does matter.